Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading a couple chapters from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, a book that I love. And there are so many wonderful characters in this book, it's just hard to pick scenes. But anyways, this first one is the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the dormouse, thought Alice. Only, as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room, they cried when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Well, then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I didn't know it was your table, said Alice. It's laid for a great many more than three. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, Why is a raven like a writing desk? Come, we shall have some fun now, thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she added aloud. Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, the March Hare went on. I do, Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. Well, that's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same thing with you, said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and said, The 4th. 2 days wrong, sighed the Hatter. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, the March Hare meekly replied. Yes, but some crumbs must have got in as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife. The March Hare took the watch, looked at it gloomily, dipped it into his cup of tea, and looked at it again, and think of nothing better to say than his first remark. It was the best butter, you know. Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. What a funny watch, she remarked. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. Why should it? Muttered the Hatter. Does your watch tell you what year it is? Of course not, Alice said very readily, but that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together. Which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. Hatter's remark seemed to her to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand you, she said as politely as she could. The Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea onto its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening its eyes, Of course, just what I was going to remark myself. Have you guessed the riddle yet? The Hatter said, turning to Alice again. No, I give up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with time, she said, than wasting it in asking riddles to which there is no answer. If you knew time as well as I do, said the Hatter, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare say you never even spoke to time. Perhaps not, Alice cautiously replied, but I know I have to beat time when I learn music. Ah, that accounts for it, said the Hatter. He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, you'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just the time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint at time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling, 1:30, time for dinner. That would be grand, certainly, said Alice thoughtfully, but then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but you could keep it to 1:30 as long as you like. Is that the way you manage? Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. Not I, he replied. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. You know the song, perhaps? I've heard something like it, said Alice. It goes on, you know, the Hatter continued, in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle. Here, the dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep. Twinkle, 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 and went on so long they had to pinch it to make it stop. Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen bawled out, He's murdering the time! Off with his head! How dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now. A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it, said the Hatter with a sigh. It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles. Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, as the things get used up. But when you come to the beginning again? Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning. I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. Then the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Wake up, Dormouse, and they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes. I wasn't asleep, he said in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. Tell us a story, said the March Hare. Yes, please do, pleaded Alice. And be quick about it, or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters, the Dormouse began in a great hurry, and their names were Elsie, Lacie, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well. What did they live on? Said Alice, who always took a great interest in things involving eating and drinking. They lived on treacle, said the Dormouse after thinking a minute or two. They couldn't have done that, you know, said Alice gravely. They'd have been ill. So they were, said the Dormouse, very ill. Alice tried a little to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on. But why did they live at the bottom of a well? Take some more tea, the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. I've had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offended tone, so I can't take more. You mean you can take less, said the Hatter. It's very easy to take more than nothing. Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice. Who's making personal remarks now? The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter. And the tea party goes on. But now I will read you a passage from the next chapter, which is called The Queen of Hearts Croquet Game. Oh, delightful. So Alice has come into a garden of roses where there are many gardeners who are all packs their cards, in hearts and various other things. And suddenly a procession arrives. Last of all this grand procession came the King and the Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the three gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession if people had to all lie down on their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She had said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What's your name, child?" My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the three gardeners who were lying around the rose tree. How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off! Off!" "Nonsense," said Alice very loudly and decidedly. And the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." "Get up," said the Queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the three gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that," screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice as the question was evidently meant for her. "Can you play croquet?" "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. "It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself up on tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. She boxed the Queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen—" "Get to your places," shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they soon got settled down, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet game in all her life. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos. The chief difficulty Alice found at last was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist around and look up into her face with such a puzzled expression that she couldn't help bursting out laughing. And when she had got its head down again and was going to begin, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. And besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to. Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs, and in a very short time the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head, off with her head," about once a minute. Alice began to feel very easy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the Queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute, And then she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin. And she said to herself, it's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to. How are you getting on? Said the cat as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared and nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come, or at least one of them. In another minute, the whole head appeared, and Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. I don't think they'd play it all fairly, Alice began in a complaining tone, and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular, at least if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, I should have croqueted the Queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming. And how do you like the Queen? Said the cat in a low voice. Not at all, said Alice. She's so extremely... Just then she noticed that the Queen was close behind her listening, so she went on, likely to win, that it's hardly worth finishing the game. The Queen smiled and passed on. Who are you talking to? Said the King, coming up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat, said Alice. Allow me to introduce it. I don't like the look of the thing at all, said the King. However, it may kiss my hand if it likes. I'd rather not, the cat remarked. Don't be impertinent, said the King, and don't look at me like that. He got behind Alice as he spoke. A cat may look at a king, said Alice. I read that in some book, but I don't remember where. Well, it must be removed, said the King very decidedly, and called to the Queen, who was passing at the moment. My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed. The Queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. Off with his head, she said, without even looking around.